This would be a great time for all four of our panel members to come up. Kranos Williams, Jason Delborn, Elizabeth Nelson, Fred Gould. And take a chair. That was kind of heavy, and actually I'd just like to take a deep breath. And I'm really impressed by the work you do, Dr. Ross. It was really quite remarkable to hear that commitment. I appreciated the questions.
Okay.
2-minute mark.
I wonder which one it is. Oh, it's you. Okay.
So the plan for this panel, this roundtable, is to offer something a little different from what has come before. When the committee was discussing how to think about interdisciplinary research, several of us asked about the process of interdisciplinarity itself, about how relationships are formed, about how they are continued, and several of our speakers have actually either spoken to that or asked about that. All of the people who are sitting in front of you today have active interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, or multidisciplinary research projects, sometimes with each other, as we will see here in a moment. And so the plan is for me to introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to ask each to speak for no more than 4 minutes, about the intellectual challenges and rewards, intellectual challenges and rewards. There are lots of challenges and rewards for research. We've heard some of those, including funding and so on, or structural disadvantages. But I want to think here, we want to think about intellectual rewards and challenges of interdisciplinary research. Laura, you're going to be our timekeeper, right? You're going to flash us the 2 minutes? Okay, I'm going to flash us the 2 minutes. So I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, the members of this group. Then my fellow moderator, Fred Gould, and I will ask some follow-ups. And then we're going to turn this panel into a conversation with you, the audience. I suspect that you're a self-selected group, that you are already doing or are interested in doing interdisciplinary work. And so this should become a conversation about the rewards, the intellectual rewards and challenges of doing that work, a conversation, so it's not just a panel. So I'm going to start with Fred Gould, who's on the far right here. Fred Gould is the godfather of interdisciplinary research and graduate training at NC State. And I mean that with love, Fred. He is the Reynolds Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology. He's a founder of one of the first interdisciplinary research clusters at NC State, now the Genetic Engineering and Society Center. Fred recently chaired the National Academies of Science report on genetically engineered crops. I'd like to thank Fred for being my co-moderator and thinking with me about this panel. Next to Fred is Kranos Williams, who is Associate Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering and Director of the NBISIS Research Lab here at NC State. The NBISIS Lab is a highly collaborative, multidisciplinary research laboratory focused on the development of models needed to manipulate and control biological systems. Kranos has a research effort with Dr. Ross Susani in plant and microbial ecology, who could not be here today, so he's going to speak on behalf of both. Next to Kranos is Elizabeth Nichols. She's a professor in forestry and environmental resources and associate faculty with the Department of Environmental and Molecular Toxicology. She's a toxicologist whose wide-ranging research on forests and waters is driven by an effort to protect surface waters and groundwater quality from point and non-point sources, as well as ensuring forest landscapes for the future. That's a very nice line, by the way, from one of your websites. She has a research effort with Jason Delborn, who's also in the College of Natural Resources and is sitting next to her. Jason is Associate Professor of Science, Policy, and Society in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources. He's a founding member of the Genetic Engineering and Society Interdisciplinary Research Cluster. Jason is a social scientist with expertise in environmental policy, among other things. So like Kranos, Elizabeth, and Fred, Jason has many achievements, but I'd like to recognize his recent naming as a university faculty fellow. Congratulations, Jason. Okay, now I'm going to sit down. Will you be our 2-minute person after all, because you're way better at it? Well, thanks.
Oops. Thank you.
So what I'd like to do now is ask each of our panelists in turn to speak for 4 minutes about their research collaboration, focusing on the intellectual and on the intellectual rewards and challenges. So Kranos, could you reflect on your partnership with Ross Sazani in plant and microbiology, and especially what I'm interested in is, what is the goal that you have together? Why did you reach out to one another across those disciplines? And what have been the benefits and rewards and challenges intellectually?
Okay. Wow, 4 minutes. So, in truth, I first met Ross during an interview for the Systems and Synthetic Biology cluster. So this was something that had emerged, the cluster itself had emerged from initiatives from myself and several other faculties, and we submitted it for that award, and it eventually got funded, and Ross was actually one of the first interviewees. And immediately, Ross stood out. She definitely stood out as an interdisciplinary researcher. She's in plant biology, but has a knack for asking the very tough questions. And pretty much I had been working in that area for probably about 3 years before that. So this was back in 2012. So ever since then, we've been working together on several initiatives, co-mentoring of students. We actually developed a cross-listed class that's cross-listed between ECE and plant biology, which really you don't really find very often, focused on modeling various levels of biological systems at the metabolic and gene regulatory levels. We've co-authored several papers. We actually funded through the same innovation grant that Ralph was talking about earlier, focused on developing nanosensors for sensing and manipulating characteristics for stress responses in plants. And a lot of those interactions pretty much emerged into this large-scale collaborative effort that we're working on now, which is focused on a proposal for an engineering research center. And it is a research center that is focused on advancing the discovery and innovation and education for next-generation agricultural solutions. So it really composes not only the research that Ross and myself are doing, but also the research of many other faculty members, Mike Kudinoff, who works on imaging and high-throughput phenotyping, Ralph Dean, as well, for working on VOCs, volatile organic compounds, and several other faculties in crop sciences, the GES, actually, and even the Pool College of Management. So it's just emerged and transformed into what has been a very intellectually rewarding experience. Oh, I still have 2 minutes. This is the alarm that I set for myself to turn the alarm off for my son when he gets home from school. So just happens to be 3:45. And you asked about, well, what are some of the things that are the most rewarding? Honestly, the great thing about working with people like Ross is the immense patience that everyone in the room has to have. You really have to be comfortable just not understanding, and in some cases being lost. And in some cases just saying, I don't know. And it's sometimes hard to find those people, but when you find them, you really tend to latch onto them because the communication gets easier, not because the problems get easier, but because being able to talk to one another gets easier. Being able to admit that you don't understand gets easier. Being able to try to shape things such that everyone can understand, not just the people who are specialists in your area, gets easier. And that in itself is particularly rewarding. And in the case of this engineering research center, we're really focused on very big visions in terms of enabling or developing the engineering technologies for enabling long-term food security. Really focused on improving aspects of pre-harvest resiliency, post-harvest food quality, and food safety. So that in itself is a very big problem and is rewarding to be able to get all of those people in the room. I was looking at my time. To get all of those people in the room to be able to address those types of problems.
Thank you. That was really thoughtful, and I think we'll return to some of the points you made because there's a lot of nodding happening up here. Elizabeth, could I ask you, why did you join with Jason Delborn, a social scientist? What is the goal of your partnership, and what have been the intellectual rewards or challenges? And I'll give Jason a chance to rebut later.
I think I have to first honestly admit that Jason's not my first social scientist to collaborate with. Why did I join with Jason? Because the project and the work that we wanted to do required that element. I think a lot of people in this room are creating great science and technology, but there's the human dimension of implementation. And the world that I was working in with wastewater and forests and treatment requires understanding how communities perceive potential changes in the future. And the experts in the room, which are in this room, or experts working for municipalities, in the world of water reuse and water security, we have to understand that we have to be engaged collectively as a community to make these changes for sustainability. So when I was reading this RFP and I thought that I was well positioned for it, I knew I needed a social scientist. And Jason had just shown up. And I recruited him or asked him to do it. He was a little hesitant, but then he came on board. And I think the rewarding part for me is learning about the other disciplines. I think one reason we do what we do is we enjoy learning. And in the past, I've worked with some other social scientists and seeing the implementation in the field for their methodology and learning through that process. I'm not going to do Jason's work, but I enjoy the collaboration to benefit from it. And I think, to me, that's the biggest reward are the different perspectives and the different insights that we bring to the same issue.
Thank you. That was also full of nodding on this panel, so I'm going to come back to at least one point there. Jason, what made you interested in working with Elizabeth, whose methods and disciplinary expectations are so different, even though you do share a department? What did you see as the rewards and challenges intellectually?
Also, not my first rodeo with a natural scientist.
It's okay.
I really enjoy that kind of work as a social scientist. My field is science and technology studies, so I think about the relationships among science, technology, and society. And part of that is thinking about the way that science and technology enter our world and how the world shapes the science and technology that gets done. So to partner with Elizabeth was a natural fit for me. But we don't always get what we expect out of these kinds of collaborations. So the initial ask from Elizabeth was, we know that changing the way that municipalities might manage their wastewater is going to be controversial. And so as we're seeking to figure out whether there are more sustainable solutions than the standard, we need to think about the way that communities are going to react to those changes. And so that seemed like quite a reasonable reason for me to be involved in the project. And so what we did was we made the whole research project more participatory. So we have a participatory leadership team that has community officials and people who work at the wastewater treatment plant and farmers in the area to be part of regular meetings about how the research gets done. And they help us deal with a broader community involvement group who we report to about once a year, where we can experiment with ways that we talk about the science that's getting done that I don't understand and I could never do. So there's that broad kind of framing of the study that makes it more participatory, but then little possibilities emerge when you're involved in work like this. So one of the things that I was noticing is that their techniques, which I can't explain to you, are very exploratory in terms of testing water, not to find a particular substance, but to scan the sample for kind of traces that could point to a lot of different things. And with some amount of certainty, we can say this is likely to be this or likely to be that, but we don't know how much is in there. We just know that it could be there. And if you think about that, that's terrifying science to produce. Because you tell people who live in a community, we've tested your water and there could be all this different kind of stuff in your water. And we can't tell you how much, and we can't tell you if it's dangerous, and we're not even sure we can verify it. But that's the science they want to do. So that's a pretty complicated problem that I'm thinking about as part of this project. And so one of the things that we did in our last community involvement group, and this was a collaborative idea, we said, what happens when you present this preliminary data and emphasize the uncertainty versus the certainty? And so we actually split our community group into two sides of the room, and one scientist who understands the technique gave the presentation with all the same slides, but emphasized the ways that we were uncertain about what we could say. And the other side of the room presented the same slides, but talked about what we were certain about. And so what we're doing now is we're looking at the data, which is the conversation among those people, and what they said in the larger group according to those different kinds of treatments. And that's not, a double-blind, careful experiment, but it can give us insight into the way that folks out in the community would respond to this very complicated research that is uncertain when we emphasize different things. So we're experimenting in real time to figure out how to communicate the kinds of results that Elizabeth and her team are producing.
So, Fred, before I ask you to come up, before I ask you to speak, I actually want to follow up with your permission, with everybody's permission, on 3 themes that I picked up, and everyone can respond to these. So the 3 that I picked up were uncertainty, experience, like not having your first rodeo, and Kranos, you said something really interesting about teaching. So I'd like to ask the 4 of you about those 3 themes. Handling uncertainty in research, because Jason, that's not just a problem for the communities in which this research is conducted. It's a fundamental problem for the researchers yourselves, right? How do you, for example, you admitted that you cannot understand fully explain some of the techniques that your partner is using. And that's just a natural part of doing interdisciplinary research. There's one theme. A second had to do with the fact that several of you appear to have worked together with people outside our disciplines before. How that habit first gets started interests me. And then Kranos, you said something about teaching, and that is, to me, in some ways, the gold standard of interdisciplinary work. Frankly, I've seen this at NC State. It's really hard to teach together across disciplines. So, wanted to throw those 3 themes out. Any of the 4 of you can have at any of those themes.
Okay. Yes, it is challenging. And it's challenging for a lot of reasons. It's, there's the obvious challenge of trying to just coordinate. Even if you had 2 people that were teaching a class from the same discipline, just being able to coordinate activities, coordinate teaching styles, et cetera, that in itself is difficult. But then you have the ability, or sometimes inability, to convey material such that even the person that you're teaching with understands. And having the resilience to go back and modify or change what it is that you're doing. Even if I've taught this class before, the way that I'm now teaching it in this interdisciplinary environment, I need to emphasize and convey things in a different way. The other major challenge is the difference in students from year to year. So like I said, it's a cross-listed course. So thus, there are students from ECE in there, there's sometimes students from biomed, ag and bioengineering, but there are also students from plant biology, there are also students from biochemistry. Some of these students have never heard MATLAB before. There may be people in the audience that may have never heard of the term MATLAB before, or an ordinary differential equation. So now, how do I convey at a high level what these concepts are so that I can drill down into the details that they're gonna need to be able to implement everything else? So that requires 2 people or multiple people that are very adaptive in terms of how they convey material, how they convey information, and are willing to switch things up. One time we gave the lectures in one order and we saw the response from the students, was not in an acceptable way where they were getting the information that we wanted, so we changed it. So being able to do that and being able to have this partner, that you're working with, that would be open to doing those type of things. And then it's being adaptive to the students' responses. I mean, when you stand up there and you start saying concepts and you see nothing but blank looks on people's faces, or you have the very weird situation of half the class is doing this, and the other half of the class is doing this. And you have to be able to notice this and see this, and in some ways, even sometimes be a counselor to the students that are not understanding the material, to be able to say, well, look, if you work with me, if we go through this process, by the end of this class, you will be able to communicate at a level where you understand the material, and you will be able to communicate with everybody in this class. And having people trust that process and seeing the look on their faces when it actually happens. We've had students in there that, I swear, we had one student in there, she looked at ordinary differential equations with a sense of hate that I really don't see very often. But by the end of the semester, she was running simulations, she was, doing everything else, and not only that, I was on her committee. She was then putting forth meaningful questions from her research and the overall research project, driving us, asking us, well, what if I were to give you these type of data? Could you do this? And that was the best transformation I've ever seen in my life. And so you say, some of the rewarding things, that's one of them. So those are my experiences in that realm.
Thank you. Anybody want to take on that question or one of the other two or topics?
I think I'd like to speak to uncertainty. And I think, to be truthful, I like uncertainty. I like risk. Perhaps I've been too risky in my past life, but I find that engaging. And the thing about interdisciplinary research that I also appreciate is bringing that together with diversity. And I think that really is the key for innovation as well as future convergence. And all those things mixed together, I think, just make for a high degree of uncertainty, which I find enticing because you don't quite know where things are going to go.
Jason?
That leaves me with the experience one, I guess. Thanks. I mean, I'll just say something which I think is fairly simple, which is that, once you've had experience doing this kind of work, you develop a respect for the kinds of expertise that you don't have. And you have to grow comfortable with knowing that you're not going to grasp everything right away. But it's so fun to begin to learn it enough to be able to have a conversation with an expert, even if you can't attain that expertise yourself. And then the other part is having the self-confidence that eventually your expertise is going to be relevant too. And I think all of us have a hard time, knowing exactly what do we know? What is our expertise? I mean, the imposter syndrome is rampant in universities. One way to deal with that is to be in an environment where your expertise is a little bit unique, and you can discover in yourself what you have to contribute and what are some of your skills, and have some of the assumptions that you might have about your own discipline questioned. And when you have to explain them to a colleague, then you're really understanding what you bring to the table. And so finding those opportunities is actually quite exciting. And you just have to kind of sit with it and be confident in your partner and confident in yourself that you can work through it.
Yeah, a lot of that echoes for me too. So Fred, I'm thinking about time. I know that you are ready to do something a little bit different. Fred, you've thought a lot about interdisciplinarity, and so you and I talked about how you might address that, and I think you have visuals.
Yeah,
right?
I think I do, huh? All right. Well, Matthew was involved in this as well. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. I've had quite a bit of interesting experiences with interdisciplinarity, and I would just, what I think is interdisciplinarity, but just to sort of say that one of the things I just want to say is that in terms of interdisciplinarity and what it does for you, I've been here this is my 41st year, and I'm in the entomology and plant pathology department. I have colleagues who are retiring. They're tired of teaching the same course over and over again and it being the same thing. Interdisciplinary opens up NC State. There's a door in every little way, and you're just in the same place, but you're entering all these new doors, and the challenges are amazing. But we've had these conversations about what is interdisciplinarity. And we actually, with the Plant Science Initiative, some of you know, we sent out a questionnaire to ask our faculty what they thought was interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinarity and all that. And some people wrote back that they thought the whole thing was just a bunch of buzzwords, and they had been doing this for their whole career. And I think that forestry and environmental resources, where you folks are, is an example of that, because if you want to solve a problem, and we've seen this today, you need that. So Matthew and I worked on a little project here that is a little bit of levity, but instead of trying to define it, we asked this question about how do you know if you're really involved in interdisciplinary work? And so the first one was when you start using someone else's jargon. You know, so how many people have experienced that? In the beginning, as all of you have been saying, like there's all this jargon. Do I understand what I'm saying? Once you start using the other person's words, you're doing something in interdisciplinarity. When you want to go to more than one seminar a day on campus, I mean, come on, a lot of you probably have had that experience, right? In a while, you go to your department seminar once a week and so on, and then all of a sudden things are opening up, right? Okay. When you have to work hard to follow the methods section in your graduate student's thesis, right? I mean, again, a lot of us are experiencing that because we're grasping so much, and it came out in this conversation. Another one, when you clock over 10,000 steps walking from one building to the other. We're going to ask you folks for more of these when we're finished here, okay? When you're not sure which of multiple department holiday parties you should attend, right? You folks know this. I know you're laughing because you know this. And I'm sure this is a self-selected group. Okay. When you're no longer surprised by the fact that the structure of your department's graduate program is seen as bizarre by your colleagues, right? How many of us have departments where for a full year, all the students have to take this whole set of required courses, and then you go over to the next department, and they have no required courses in the department? Right? How many of them you come in and you have a major professor or you can't come in to the department, and how many have rotations you're not allowed to have, right? How do we, facing these things? Interdisciplinarity is not easy is the deal on that part, okay? When you give up trying to figure out which department gets credit for your teaching. All right? When you can remember more than a handful of times when your most cherished paradigms were shown to be flawed, right? And I think all of you on this panel know that. I always say that when I really recognized I was doing interdisciplinarity is when I would get so angry in a workshop because I found out that they were right. I mean, it's hard sometimes, you have this ego. And I think that you were talking to that a lot, right? Because you go and you don't understand, how do you do that? And when you can't figure out how to introduce yourself. And when you know people in every college on the campus. And then when you sit on more doctoral committees outside your department than in it. And now, what else? I know it's putting you on the spot, but what tells you that you're changing and you're doing this? Yeah.
So Laura has a microphone, and she's asked that we pass around the mic if people in the audience want to start answering this question too. But first, I think Kranos has an answer.
One to add to that, when you walk into a doctoral student committee, and you have to really figure out which rules you're going by because they change from department to department.
Yeah.
When you choose which journal to publish in, not because it does something for your disciplinary ranking, but because it's the best journal to publish that result in.
That's good.
When you pick a research method to solve a problem that you really don't know how to do, and you've got to struggle to apply it.
Where do you want to go from here? Do you want to just open it up to other people's experiences?
When your LinkedIn profile title is a sentence instead of 3 words.
Okay, I'll let you go ahead.
So any more thoughts about that question from the 4 of you up here? Any additions?
Good list.
It's a good list. Okay, so we set aside 20 minutes. We have 17 minutes and 47 seconds, not bad, for conversation with you about this question, about the question of interdisciplinarity and what its intellectual rewards and challenges are. And so I suggested earlier that you're probably a self-selected group. I think that's been proven true in the 2-minute lightning conversations where people solicited help from others or engagement. But I also know that people in this audience represent a wide range of interdisciplinary initiatives and collaborations on campus. The 4 of us, the 5 of us, represent some of those collaborations, but I really wanted to give, the committee wanted to give this opportunity for the audience as a whole to start talking about those collaborations, lessons learned, especially around the intellectual challenges and rewards. So we have a microphone that Laura has handy for you to raise a hand and say something about one of your interdisciplinary collaborations, and perhaps to speak to the questions we've been asking this panel up front. So Ann Ross has her hand up front.
Thank you. So one of the challenges that we've had with the forensics cluster is how do we come up with a really good interdisciplinary project that will fit an RFP? Because we have chemists, we have people that do DNA, we've got entomology. So how do we pick a project that can encompass all of that? So that's been one of our challenges.
Do people on the panel have a thought about that or an experience with that?
I guess some of the things that we end up doing is looking for larger projects. So looking for RFPs with a wider vision, not necessarily something that is narrow in scope. And in part because a lot of the stuff that we do, we can't afford it if it was a more narrow grant. I'm always amazed by how much money these experiments cost. You know, my lab consists of computers and the students that stand next to them. You know, so you know and then the difficulty in terms of the time and everything that it takes. So widening the scope has typically worked for us in a good way.
Just to pile on to that one, or Jason, did you want to?
Go ahead.
Just to pile on, I would say one thing in the cluster that I help coordinate, the visual narrative cluster, we fail a lot. I mean, we have spent just a tremendous amount of energy applying to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council for Learned Societies, the National Science Foundation. Yeah, so, yeah.
I will say, you know, as a social scientist, I think there's a growing appetite for thinking about the social dimensions and the political and ethical dimensions of science and technology. And so for me, it hasn't been difficult to be seen as an asset to a project in terms of bringing a perspective, whether that's about how the research gets done, how it gets disseminated, or the kinds of policy questions that might be associated with the scientific or technological development. So I think there's a real opportunity on this campus to think about what's, you know, I mean, I always laugh a little bit when I hear that interdisciplinary is like soil science and atmospheric science. Like, ooh. I know that is interdisciplinary, but in my experience, you know, crossing the aisle between the natural and physical science and the social science and humanities is really difficult, but it can be incredibly rewarding. And so one thing to look for are those kinds of really tough collaborations where you're reaching way outside your comfort zone.
Yeah, I would say that in some ways there's a bipolar kind of thing where some of the RFPs are incredibly narrow and they are smaller typically. And then NSF and USCA as well are looking for these huge projects that you talk about. And you have to fit into those RFPs. And I think when you are in that middle ground, right, where it is the hardest to find that.
So I should preface this question by saying that I'm a computer science PhD who's now a tenured professor in the marketing department at the Polk College of Management. And so my question is, I fully buy in. The interdisciplinary research is very rewarding, obviously, given my background. But how do we change the mindset within the colleges to reward people who pursue interdisciplinary research? And should it just be for those people who are tenured, right? Or should we somehow change the mindset for our colleagues for untenured faculty as well in this space. Thanks.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, it is.
But I would say, you know, I think that things are changing. You know, sometimes it seems glacial, but I do think that that things are moving, so that I really would not say that just because you're an assistant professor, you shouldn't be involved in these kind of things. I think that at our university especially, we typically have tenure decisions made within departments and within programs, but there are abilities, you know, to have an interdisciplinary tenure committee, but I think there's some room for something in between. And so I think I would say that if you were an assistant professor and you want to get involved in interdisciplinary stuff, you have to have all of that stuff laid out with your mentor committee or whoever the department head is, and make sure that there is a mutual understanding about what that's going to be when you come up for tenure.
So I can speak to that question personally. So I started in 2008. And in 2008, the number of faculty that were working on plant systems in the electrical and computer engineering was 1. Today, it's probably about 6 or so, give or take. Persistence and some level of success. But success arises from persistence. So over the time that I've been here, which I was the one person working on plant systems, there have been the emergence of the first round of cluster hires. There's been the emergence of the second round of cluster hires. There's been the emergence of various training programs, interdisciplinary training programs. There's been the emergence of these interdisciplinary centers. There's been the emergence of the PSI. And now there's been the emergence of this call for fourth generation convergent engineering research centers. So, like Fred said, it's moving. It's moving in that direction. And you just have to identify good people to work with, good ideas, establish a good vision, and move forward. And at the same time, get the people in your department to understand why what you're doing is important. Because some knew, but most know now. And it's really related to a lot of the things that we've been able to do on the campus.
I think I'd want to speak specifically to your question about being junior faculty. And I think from my prior experience, before Jason, that was really important to ensure, particularly at the end of the project or towards the end when you're putting out your publications and you know that's really where you're going to get your outcomes and metrics from, that there's got to be something for everyone at the table in that context, and that the PI of the project or the management team has to ensure that it's going to be of benefit to everybody. And it's a thought on my mind with our current collaboration in terms of how you line up the outputs of those publications so that there's something that resonates for all the disciplines. And I think that would be important to junior faculty to make sure that they're still getting those metrics as they go through the tenure process.
I want to pile on because it's such an important question. From the perspective of my discipline, history, historians at NC State have been quite open to new methods. And in fact, if I think about the recent hires in my program, I was hired in 2004. I have a master's degree in environmental science. Recent colleagues come from anthropology. The digital humanities effort at NC State in the history department has relied on people having training outside of traditional historical methods. So that kind of omnivory comes rather naturally to historians. We have to be scavengers. But it's been interesting to see this department and also my dean and others embrace that kind of diversity within the new faculty. So in some ways our success, the success of our younger faculty in particular, comes from that built-in experience. And also the clusters have helped. The cluster that I'm helping to coordinate, when we hired only one person who had tenure. So 2 of them were straight out of graduate school, still in graduate school. So setting up the arrangements for tenure, protecting those new faculty, making sure they were going to succeed, all that got worked out in advance before the hiring process really got underway and during it.
I kind of echo a lot of what's been said. I mean, you can form collaborations at different levels. You can form huge groups, small groups, intermediate groups. But I think we see now on this campus a real spirit for developing new ideas and forming collaborations. And I think you can, surprisingly, I think it's just a question of picking up the reins and going with something. Because I think departments will want to support these things, colleges want to support these things. I mean, that's been my experience. You have an idea, you form a group of people, you have no idea where the hell you're going, okay? But you think you've got a good idea. You go out and sell it to get the support of your department head, okay, and then you start looking at the college level for support. And I think everybody will be amazed that modest amounts of money will flow to make those things happen, and that's what you can build on. Because I think departments and colleges are looking for innovation, they're looking for new ideas, and they're very supportive of to give you seed money, to get something going. So I don't think it's a question of, oh God, where am I going to get the money? I think if you put a team together, okay, and you have an idea that you believe in, I think you will be successful. But it's that first step, getting the group together and then moving forward to get that small money to get something going. And that's where the innovation will come in. And I think that's what the colleges and departments are looking for. And that's been my experience. And I see us moving more and more into that arena with the cluster hires and all that stuff. So I think the answer is we shouldn't be afraid to try new stuff. I mean, you could argue, well, if you're an assistant professor, maybe you could be a big problem. But you never put all your irons in one fire, that's for sure. But I think we will be rewarded for trying new things. That's my opinion.
Other questions? Comments? Well, I have a comment, if no one's going to raise their hand. Wait, Cressy has a question. Good. Stop me.
I like stopping you. I wanted to add something to how do you know you're really involved in interdisciplinary work. And I think it is when you realize the sacred values that you held on to and the concepts, your disciplinary concepts that other people share are not defined the same way. So you say the same thing, or you say, yeah, you think you're saying the same thing, but you mean totally different things, right? So that's one of the things I've learned in interdisciplinary work. A couple of projects that I've been involved in related to interdisciplinary work is not from research questions that are generated by us. They are generated by communities and community members, right? And so you never know what the disciplinary expertise is going to be until you get into it, right? And then you have to say, oh, we need to bring in this person or we need to bring in this group. And that's been the joy for me, right? Learning about new things I never thought I would even care about, right? But understanding in the end how they work together has been one of the best benefits of interdisciplinary work.
Matthew, I'm going to stop you too. Because I just want to comment on what you're saying. And a part of it is, that you get a group together and then you try to think about who you need to bring in. And I think there's some of that, but some of it is who comes to your door. And, I think about some of the interdisciplinary things that I'm involved in, and they could have moved in a lot of different directions depending upon who joined us. And there's such a stochasticity to how that happens. I mean, the fact that Matthew showed up in my office, probably we think because his department head said something, or that I'm doing a project on that's going to be in the museum on art and biotechnology because I was friends with somebody who's works in the libraries, and it just happened to happen. So I think there is a lot of where you look for somebody, but there's a lot of who's willing to come in that shape where you go. So I just wanted to comment on that.
Also, if I can just build on something that you said that made me think about this, is that the world isn't organized according to discipline. So we have these structures within the university, and we have our own training that's done this way. But when we go out into the world and try to engage other audiences, they're confused when you want to stay within your discipline. And so I feel like some of the opportunities I've had to do what I think of as more engaged scholarship, working with different kinds of task forces and committees that are organized around problems and challenges, I feel like I'm better prepared to contribute to those because I'm not stuck in one disciplinary way of thinking. I have the experience of having conversations across discipline, and my knowledge is broad enough that I can participate and communicate to audiences outside the university who don't expect you to be stuck in your own jargon or your own way of thinking.
I think we'll make this the last question.
No, you get the last comment, though.
Yeah, so the purpose of this whole session here today is to try to make more connections within the university to help promote this. Is there something else that the university could do, or something else that the faculty could do to, I mean, Fred, you said it depends on who comes and knocks on your door. Well, how do people get motivated to come knock on Fred's door? I'm gonna come knock on your door soon, but it's just, how do you, is it just this personal motivation that enables it, or is it more than that? Is it something that we could do as a community to make that more feasible or more, lower that barrier?
I'd like to respond to that, because I had a conversation with Fred Wright around by the posters, and we were talking about how we do attract people who are already interested in this, and how do we get everybody else involved, and how does the university do that? And I think he recommended that we have a concert with Bono come here, and then we lock the doors. But I think that there may be something else. I mean, the question is, how do we get the people in here who are not here today, right? And I think that that's something the university could do, and we need to figure out those mechanisms so that it isn't just you happen to know somebody, but that there's something a little bit more defined.
Well, we don't have to actually have a concert with Bono. You just have to say that there is, and then when people show up. I mean, I think I sense, or I see a lot of incentives in the university to work across colleges, internal grants and things like that. One area where I see a huge disincentive is in collaborative teaching. So I've been a part of a couple projects through the Genetic Engineering and Society Center, and it's really hard to figure out a way to allow two faculty from different departments or different colleges to co-teach a class. But it's those relationships where, boy, you really learn what somebody else, I mean, I see so many heads nodding, you really learn what someone else can add to thinking through a problem when you teach a whole semester with them. It's a lot of work. It's really hard. It's time consuming. But that kind of payoff would be amazing. And if there's a way to incentivize those kinds of relationships, that could be a different way to get people out of their silos.
That's it, one last thing. Greg, I think one way is to, so thus far we've talked a lot about the benefits and the joys and the intellectual satisfaction that we get from doing interdisciplinary work, but also conveying the fact that it can be frustrating, that it can be, you can have a meeting and you can spend an hour or an hour and a half talking about various things within that meeting, and you come out of it feeling like, what in the world did I just do? And sometimes that happens. And the idea is that, or conveying that to individuals and saying, well, the first time you interact in these interdisciplinary meeting, or someone asks you whether or not you want to meet and nothing comes out of it, or you feel very discouraged, understanding that that is a possibility, but you have to go through that process maybe 1, 2, 3, 5 more times to be able to actually find the right connections, or even to have the right conversation. Because that person may be the right person, but you're not speaking the same language, so thus one individual has no idea how they can contribute. Well, it's gonna take about 3 or 4 more times to actually do this. And then another way is potentially identifying individuals, targeted individuals, who can start to link people together. Because I've been in many situations where I see one person over here, I see another person over there. This person doesn't know how their research can actually influence the work that we're doing, but I see it because I have an idea of actually what's going on in those two camps. So, you can try to bring them together. So having individuals like that can potentially motivate, those types of interactions, that might be another possibility.
We hoped it would be a good conversation. It was. And I think we're
One suggestion.
good. We're not getting the hook.
I'll try to be quick. When I was at Duke the last year, they had a couple of things for integration and for teaching that I wanted to share. So the first was they have a risk center, or developing risk center, and the whole concept is to get different folks across the institute to attend like a monthly, they called it watering hole event, and it was just like informal after hours, like 4:30 to 6 or so, and they rotated different speakers. So they had like maybe 3 or 4 folks, just like you, give a small, 5-minute spiel about what they were doing, and then other people could get to know them better. But the risk watering hole was just like an informal gathering for risk people. And as many of you know, like risk is really a multidisciplinary topic because you have the science and you have the social science and ethics and policy, whatever. So this risk watering hole is one suggestion I had for you. And then the second one was also at Duke, they have something called the Basque Connections program, where it's a teaching, a different type of teaching system or program where they would have a class focused on a topic, but it was intentionally geared towards multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary students, and also across levels. So there was a combination of undergrads and graduate students and even postdocs there. So you have like different layers of education types, all focus on a complex issue. So the course that I was involved in, it was about looking back through the problem with CFCs and how we came to the Montreal Protocol Agreement, and then looking at climate change, which obviously is another complex multidisciplinary project. But anyway, I was just thinking that these two mechanisms could be helpful for how to get NC State like having a real mechanism for both interaction and for teaching.
Thank you for that. Those are good concrete examples of what people with small administrative budgets can accomplish. If you can, really, I'm serious, if you can buy some beer and some pizza, or maybe not beer if you're in certain colleges, you can get a lot done in terms of fostering these relationships. So thank you for those comments. I appreciate it. Our time is up. The next event is happening. I'm really grateful to our panelists. Thank you, panelists, for putting yourselves on the line in this way and starting this conversation.